There is a silence between stars that most species never truly understand. It is not the absence of sound, for sound requires atmosphere and proximity and the fragile conditions that cradle life. No, the silence between stars is something deeper, a vast and patient emptiness that existed before the first civilizations rose and will remain long after the last of them falls to dust. I have lived long enough to hear that silence speak. My name is Vaelith, and I am old. Not merely in the way that flesh ages and cells degrade, but in the way that memory becomes heavier than bone. I have served the Kethvarani ascendancy for 417 cycles, longer than most of my species lives, though we measure our existence in centuries rather than the brief decades that define lesser races. I was young when we first encountered humanity. I was present when the Council of Eternal Voices declared them contained. And I am here now, as everything my civilization built across 6,000 years threatens to collapse into nothing. The bridge of the serenity of purpose hummed with the soft resonance of dying systems. We had lost auxiliary power in 3 sections. Our shield matrices operated at 40% capacity. Of the 17 vessels that had departed the homeworld 3 cycles ago, only 4 remained. The others had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris. Their crews, thousands of my kindred, scattered across the void like seeds that would never grow. Commander Yethril stood beside me, her silver-white carapace dulled by exhaustion and radiation exposure. She had not rested in 9 cycles. None of us had. "Vaelith," she said quietly, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones that marked our species' speech. "The devouring tide has taken Kethril Prime." I did not respond immediately. I let the words settle into the silence between us, let them find their weight. Kethril Prime, the third of our core worlds, 7 billion lives. "The orbital defenses?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Overwhelmed in 6 hours. The evacuation ships were intercepted before they could reach safe transit distance. Yethril's compound eyes, normally brilliant amber, had faded to a tired bronze. High Counselor Varath's flagship was among the destroyed. Another name to add to the silence. Another voice that would never speak again. I turned toward the forward observation port and let my gaze settle on the stars beyond. They seemed dimmer now, though I knew that was merely the perception of a mind grown weary with grief. The galaxy had not changed. Only we had changed. Only we were dying. "How long until the tide reaches the remaining systems?" I asked. "At current advancement rates, 17 to 22 cycles, perhaps less if they complete assimilation of Kethril Prime's industrial infrastructure." Yethril moved closer, lowering her voice. "The Council is in disarray. 3 factions are already negotiating separate surrenders. The fleet communion has fractured. We are—" She did not finish. She did not need to. "We were ending 6,000 years of civilization. 6,000 years of art and philosophy and scientific achievement. 6,000 years of believing ourselves to be the eldest, the wisest, the most enduring presence in this arm of the galaxy. And now, in the span of a single decade, we were being erased by an enemy we did not understand and could not defeat. The devouring tide had no diplomats. They did not negotiate. They did not conquer in the traditional sense. They simply consumed, absorbing worlds, populations, and technology into their ever-expanding collective. We had first encountered them 30 years ago at the edge of explored space. We had sent diplomatic envoys. None returned. We had sent fleets. They returned as part of the tide. There is one possibility remaining, I said, the words heavy on my tongue. One option the Council has refused to consider. Yethral's carapace shifted with discomfort. Vaelithrin? I know what it means. I know what they are. But we are dying, Commander. Our fleets are shattered. Our worlds are burning. If there is even a small chance— They are contained, she interrupted. The blockade has held for 160 years. The quarantine protocols are clear. Opening communication with a species designated as an existential threat would require unanimous Council approval, and the Council is— The Council is scattered, leaderless, and preparing to surrender, I finished. The protocols were written when we believed ourselves invincible. That belief is now ash. I turned to face her fully, and for a long moment we simply looked at each other. I could see the conflict in her posture, the fear and the desperation, and the terrible hope that she was trying not to feel. The humans, she said finally, the word almost a whisper. The humans, I confirmed. The containment of Earth was one of the Ascendancy's oldest active protocols. 163 years ago, our long-range observation posts had detected the first signals emanating from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star on the outer spiral of the galaxy. The signals were crude, electromagnetic broadcasts, radio waves, the fumbling attempts of a primitive species to announce their existence to the void. We had studied them as we studied all emerging civilizations. We had cataloged their biology, their social structures, their technological progression. And then, as they began to reach beyond their atmosphere, we had made a decision. The humans were not like other species. Their history was a chronicle of war. Their biology was marked by persistence, an immune system that fought with remarkable aggression, a reproductive rate that could replenish populations devastated by disaster, a neurological structure that processed trauma and converted it into adaptation. Where other species evolved toward equilibrium, humans evolved toward survival at any cost. They had nearly destroyed themselves multiple times. Nuclear weapons, biological catastrophes, environmental collapse, and each time they had pulled back from the edge, not through wisdom, but through sheer stubbornness. They refused to die. This, the Council determined, made them dangerous. Not dangerous in the way of a predator species or a conquest-driven empire, dangerous in a deeper, more troubling way, dangerous in their potential. The projections were clear. If humanity was allowed to develop unfettered, they would reach interstellar capability within 2 centuries. And once they began to spread, their adaptive nature and aggressive problem-solving would make them a dominant force in galactic politics. They would not be content to join existing structures. They would challenge them, change them. Eventually, they might surpass them. And so, the containment protocol was enacted. A fleet of 400 vessels was positioned in a spherical formation around their star system, not close enough to be detected by their primitive sensors, but close enough to intercept any attempt to leave. Any probe, any colony ship, any transmission that crossed the boundary was quietly eliminated or jammed. Earth became a sealed world. Humanity was allowed to develop in isolation, monitored but never contacted, studied but never acknowledged. The Ascendancy watched them build stations in orbit around their moon, watched them send probes to neighboring planets, watched them develop faster-than-light theories that would never be tested beyond their prison. We told ourselves it was mercy, that we were protecting the galaxy from a species that would bring chaos, that we were protecting humanity from its own nature. I believed that once. I was young. Now I am old, and I am desperate, and I am piloting a dying ship toward the very quarantine zone I helped establish. Contact in 6 hours, the navigation officer announced, her voice flat with exhaustion. We are approaching the outer boundary of the containment zone. I stood at the command platform, watching the approaching coordinates on the holographic display. Somewhere ahead, invisible against the backdrop of stars, were the silent sentinels of the blockade. They would detect us soon. Send identification codes, I ordered. Flag our vessel as diplomatic priority. Commander Yethril moved to stand beside me. Even with proper codes, protocol requires quarantine approval from the Council. We don't have that. The blockade commanders may refuse to let us approach. They may, I agreed. And if they fire on us? Then we die slightly sooner than we would otherwise. A minor distinction, given our circumstances. The black humor did not land well. Yethril's carapace rippled with discomfort, and she turned away. I understood her fear. What I was proposing violated every principle we had been taught to believe. The containment of humanity was not merely a strategic decision, it had become almost religious over the centuries. The humans were spoken of in hushed tones, a cautionary tale, an example of what unchecked ambition could become. To break the blockade, to make contact, was heresy. But heresy, I had learned, was often simply a word for necessity that makes people uncomfortable. 4 hours later, we crossed the boundary. The response was immediate. Multiple contacts, the sensor officer reported. 14 vessels on intercept trajectory. They're requesting immediate identification and authorization. Provide both. Tell them. I paused, considering my words. Tell them Valathrin of the Eternal Voice Council requests emergency consultation. Tell them Kethril Prime has fallen. Tell them we are not here on behalf of the Ascendancy. We are here because there is no Ascendancy left to act on behalf of. The bridge fell silent. The communication officer's hands trembled slightly as she relayed the message. I watched her movements, noting the small hesitations, the way she had to force herself to form each word. She had been raised on stories of human unpredictability. We all had. Minutes passed. Then, finally, a response. This is Blockade Commander Sethil Vorn. Your message has been received. Approach vector is being transmitted. You will dock at Station Vigilant for assessment. Any deviation from the transmitted course will result in immediate termination. Standard protocol. Cold, efficient, familiar. But there was something in the commander's voice. A hesitation. A weight. He's afraid, Yethril observed quietly. Yes, I agreed. Not of us. Of what we might force him to do. Station Vigilant was massive, an orbital fortress constructed in the first years of the containment. It housed the blockade's command infrastructure, over 10,000 personnel, and enough weaponry to reduce a small moon to rubble. It was also, I realized as we approached, nearly empty. The docking bays were dark. The patrol routes that should have been filled with fighter screens were bare. Where 400 ships once maintained the perimeter, perhaps 60 remained. They've been redeployed,
I said, understanding settling cold in my chest. The tide's advance has forced a reallocation of resources.
The blockade has been weakened, Yethril agreed. If the humans attempted a breakout now,
they would succeed.
The thought hung between us. 160 years of containment, and it could be ended by a concentrated effort. A species that had developed for over a century and a half in isolation, completely unaware that they were prisoners, could simply leave.
Unless they already knew.
The docking procedure was clinical and silent. We were escorted by armed guards through corridors that echoed with emptiness. I saw the faces of my kinsmen, exhausted, frightened, worn thin by years of watching the galaxy collapse while they remained assigned to a prison for a species that had never tried to escape.
Blockade Commander Sethelvorn met us in a conference chamber overlooking the containment zone. Behind him, through a massive observation window, I could see the distant yellow star that had birthed humanity. Earth itself was invisible at this distance, just another mote of dust orbiting a fire.
Counselor Violethrin, Sethelvorn said, his voice carrying the formal harmonics of official address. Your reputation precedes you. I understand you were instrumental in establishing the protocols I now enforce.
I was, I confirmed,
and I am here to ask you to end them.
Silence.
Sethelvorn's expression did not change, but I saw the shift in his posture, the subtle stiffening of his carapace. You understand what you're asking.
I do. You understand that any communication with the contained species would void 163 years of careful management, would expose them to galactic affairs they are entirely unprepared for, would release a factor into the geopolitical equation that cannot be predicted or controlled. I understand all of this.
And yet you ask anyway. I stepped closer to the observation window, letting my gaze settle on that distant yellow star. Commander, how many worlds have fallen to the tide in the past cycle?
He hesitated. 17, confirmed. 12 more are under active assault.
How many of our fleet remain operational? 32% of pre-war strength.
How long until the tide reaches the core systems?
Estimates vary. Between 8 and 15 cycles.
I turned back to face him. In 15 cycles, Commander, every species we have sworn to protect will be consumed. Every civilization we have guided for millennia will cease to exist. Every principle we have defended will be ash. I let the words settle. The humans cannot be worse than extinction. Nothing can be worse than extinction.
Sethelvorn was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he moved to the observation window and stood beside me.
There is something you should know, he said quietly. Something that is not in any report, because I have not known how to report it.
Tell me. 14 cycles ago, we detected an anomaly. A vessel departing Earth's orbital space, moving on a trajectory that would take it beyond the containment boundary.
My hearts, both of them, stopped.
A breakout attempt?
No. Sethelvorn's voice was strange, almost reverent. We moved to intercept 4 cruisers on optimal vectors, and then he paused. The vessel stopped. It simply stopped right at the edge of the boundary, and it transmitted.
Transmitted what?
A message. In our language, Counselor. In perfect, unaccented Kethfarani. It said, "We know you are there. We know why you watch. When you are ready to speak, we will listen."
I could not breathe. could not think.
Then it turned around, Sethelvorn continued, returned to Earth. And there has been nothing since. No further attempts, no signals, nothing but silence.
They knew, I whispered. All this time, they knew.
And they waited. They could have forced the issue, their technology. Sethelvorn shook his head. Our sensors could barely track that vessel, Counselor. It moved in ways our analysts could not explain. If they had wanted to break the blockade, they could have, but they didn't. They are still waiting.
Waiting for what? Sethelvorn turned to look at me, and for the first time I saw something like hope in his exhausted eyes.
Perhaps for us to ask for help.
This is Counselor Valithrin of the Kethvarani Ascendancy. We have watched you for 163 years. We contained you because we were afraid. We are still afraid, but now we are also dying. If you are willing to speak, we are willing to listen.
The transmission was sent.
And then we waited. Hours passed. They felt like years.
I did not leave the communication center. Yethril brought me nutrition supplements that I did not eat. Officers came and went, their footsteps careful, their voices hushed. The entire station seemed to be holding its breath.
Then, 16 hours after my message was sent, a response came.
Not a communication. A vessel.
Contact detected, the sensor officer reported, her voice trembling. Single ship, departing Earth orbital space. Speed is not registering correctly. Recalibrating.
How fast? It crossed the orbital boundary of their 5th planet in 11 minutes. That's not possible. Nothing we have moves that fast. I moved to the sensor display, watching the small point of light approaching. It did not move like a ship. It moved like a thought. Instant, unstoppable, utterly without regard for the distances involved.
37 minutes later, it arrived at the station.
The vessel was small, barely larger than one of our short-range shuttles. Its hull was matte black, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. There were no visible weapons, no sensors, no engines, just a smooth, featureless shape that seemed to exist at the edge of perception.
And then a signal.
Station Vigilant, this is Captain Elena Vance of the ESV Breaking Dawn. I have been authorized by United Earth Command to receive your diplomatic delegation. Permission to dock.
The voice was calm, measured, polite, and utterly, impossibly human.
I met her in the docking bay.
Elena Vance was shorter than I expected. Humans were compact creatures, smaller than my species by a significant margin. She had dark hair cut short, brown skin weathered by what I assumed was age, and eyes that seemed to see through me rather than at me. She was accompanied by 2 others, a younger man with pale skin and nervous hands, and an older woman whose silver hair was pulled back in a tight configuration. They wore simple uniforms, dark gray with minimal decoration. No visible weapons, no obvious technology.
Counselor Valithrin, Captain Vance said, extending her hand.
I had studied human greeting customs. I took her hand gently, mindful of my greater size, and felt the warmth of her skin against my carapace.
Captain Vance, I replied. Thank you for responding.
You said you were dying. That seemed worth a conversation.
Her directness caught me off guard. I had expected hesitation, anger, perhaps hostility. We had imprisoned her species for over a century. We had watched them struggle toward the stars while we ensured they could never reach them. And yet here she stood, calm and composed, as if we were simply two strangers meeting for the first time.
"You are not angry," I said. "I expected anger."
Vance's expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile, but something close to it. We had time to move past anger. 160 years is a long time to be angry. She gestured toward the corridor. "May we speak somewhere more comfortable?"
I led them to the conference chamber. The view of Earth's sun still dominated the window, a silent witness to a conversation that should have been impossible.
As we walked, I observed the humans carefully. Their movements were efficient, purposeful. They did not waste motion. The younger man, who introduced himself as Lieutenant Park, constantly scanned his surroundings without appearing to do so. The older woman, Dr. Shaw, watched me with an analytical gaze that reminded me of our own scientists.
They were taking data, I realized. Cataloging, analyzing. Even now, even here, they were learning. We settled into the conference chamber. The humans sat across from us, and for a long moment, no one spoke.
Then Captain Vance folded her hands on the table and looked directly at me.
"You want our help against the devouring tide?"
It was not a question.
"How do you know about the tide?" I asked.
We've been listening for a long time. Your containment was effective at preventing physical escape, but signals are harder to contain. We've been aware of the galactic situation for approximately 37 years.
37 years. They had known about the tide almost as long as we had. They had watched the war unfold, watched our civilization crumble, watched everything burn, and they had said nothing.
Why did you not reach out? Yethril demanded, her voice sharper than protocol allowed. If you knew what was happening?
Why would we? Vance replied, and there was no hostility in her voice, only a patient certainty that was somehow more unsettling. You made it clear you didn't want us involved. You put a ring of warships around our star and told us, through that ring, that we were not welcome in your galaxy. We respected that decision.
We were wrong. Perhaps, or perhaps you were right. Perhaps we would have caused chaos. Perhaps we would have made things worse. Vance shrugged slightly. We don't know. You didn't give us the chance to find out. But that was your choice to make.
I felt something shifting in my understanding. I had expected the humans to be savage, primitive, driven by the rage and resentment that our actions should have earned. Instead, I found something more unsettling. Acceptance.
They had not forgiven us, but they had moved beyond the need for forgiveness.
The devouring tide cannot be stopped, I said. We have tried everything: military engagement, negotiation, technological countermeasures. Nothing works. They absorb everything we send against them and become stronger.
We know. Then why are you here if you already know we cannot win? Because you can't win, Vance interrupted gently, but that doesn't mean it can't be won. The briefing that followed lasted for hours. Captain Vance spoke with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed these words many times. Dr. Shaw provided technical details when necessary. Lieutenant Park remained silent, watching, always watching. What they told us was impossible. And yet, I believed them. During the containment, Vance explained, we were forced to develop in isolation. We couldn't reach the stars, but we could see them. We knew you were there. We knew there was more beyond our boundary, and so we focused our efforts inward. Inward?
Technology, biology, society. We couldn't expand outward, so we expanded in every other direction. We improved ourselves, our systems, our understanding of physics and biology and the nature of existence.
She activated a holographic display, the technology seamless, beautiful, far beyond anything we had provided her.
Earth has a population of 19 billion. Every one of them is educated to a level that would qualify them as an expert in your society. Every one of them has access to medical technology that has eliminated disease, extended lifespan, and optimized biological function. We have automated manufacturing that can produce materials at molecular precision. We have computational systems that would take your analysts decades to understand.
The images shifted. I saw cities, massive, gleaming structures that stretched toward the sky and burrowed deep into the earth. I saw orbital stations that dwarfed anything in our fleet. I saw ships, thousands of ships, waiting in precise formation above a blue and green world.
You built all of this, I breathed, in 160 years?
We had motivation, Vance said, and for the first time, something hard entered her voice. We knew we were prisoners. We knew we were being watched. We knew that someday, somehow, we would need to prove ourselves. So we prepared.
Why not break the blockade?
Because we weren't ready. Not ready technologically. We surpassed your containment capability approximately 40 years ago. Not ready ethically. We didn't know enough about the galaxy. We didn't know who our captors really were, or why they feared us. We didn't want to emerge as conquerors. We wanted to emerge as partners.
She paused, letting the weight of her words settle.
And then the tide came, and we realized that the question was never about what we wanted. It was about what was necessary.
I sat in silence, processing everything I had heard. The humans had not been imprisoned by our blockade, they had been incubated by it, forced into a pressure cooker of necessity. They had transformed themselves from a primitive species on the edge of self-destruction into something else entirely.
Something we had never imagined.
Something we had every reason to fear.
You said the war can be won, I finally managed. How?
Vance looked at me for a long moment, and then she smiled. It was a small smile, tired around the edges, but real.
The tide works by consumption, by absorption. It takes what it encounters and makes it part of itself. This works because every species it has encountered has been fundamentally similar, built on the same biological and technological frameworks, separated by degrees of development, but not by kind.
And humans are different?
Humans are incompatible. Dr. Shaw leaned forward, her eyes bright with what I recognized as intellectual passion. Our biology is aggressive in ways that don't exist elsewhere in the galaxy. Our immune systems don't just fight infection, they hunt it, they adapt, they learn. Every human carries within them the capacity to wage war at the cellular level.
And our technology reflects that, Vance added. Our systems don't wait to be attacked. They anticipate, they evolve, they fight back. The tide has never encountered something that refuses to be consumed, something that consumes back. I felt cold, a different kind of cold than the fear of extinction. This was the cold of standing beside something vast and dangerous and realizing with terrible clarity that you have been fortunate it was never turned against you.
You could defeat them, I said. It was not a question.
We believe so.
Then why haven't you? You've known about the tide for 37 years. You could have acted at any time. Captain Vance's expression shifted. The calm receded, and for a moment I saw something beneath it, something old and patient and infinitely weary.
Because you told us to stay. The words hung in the air.
We respected your boundaries, she continued. We honored your containment, even when we could have broken it. We watched your civilizations fall. We watched billions die. We watched species that had existed for millennia be erased from history. And we did nothing, because that was what you asked us to do. We didn't ask. You didn't have to ask in words, Counselor. You built a wall around our world and told us through that wall that we were not welcome, that we were too dangerous, too unpredictable, too human. She leaned back, her gaze steady. We learned our lesson. We stayed quiet, and we waited for you to be ready to ask for help.
I understood then. I understood everything. The containment had never been about protecting the galaxy from humanity. It had been about protecting our pride, our sense of superiority, our comfortable certainty that we, the ancient and wise Kethvarani, understood the universe better than anyone else.
And that pride had cost us everything. I am asking now, I said, and my voice broke on the words. On behalf of my species, my civilization, and every living being that faces extinction at the hands of the tide, I am asking for your help. Captain Elena Vance looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded. We know. She stood, and her crew stood with her.
The Breaking Dawn will return to Earth with your formal request. You will have a response within 48 hours. She paused at the door, looking back over her shoulder. I suggest you prepare your remaining fleets for coordination. When we will move fast, and we will only do this once.
43 hours later, the silence broke. I was on the observation deck of Station Vigilant when it happened. I had not slept. I had not eaten. I had simply stood there, staring at that distant yellow star, waiting for something I could not name. And then the sensor officer's voice came over the comm, trembling with disbelief. Counselor, you need to see this. I moved to the tactical display, and what I saw there stopped my hearts. Ships. Not dozens, not hundreds. Thousands. They emerged from the boundary of the containment zone in perfect formation, wave after wave of vessels that ranged from small, agile interceptors to carriers larger than anything in the Kethvarani fleet. They moved with absolute precision, each ship knowing its place, each crew executing their role with mechanical perfection.
And they kept coming.
27,000 vessels and counting, the sensor officer reported, her voice hollow. Counselor, how did they?
I had no answer. I could only watch as the fleet of humanity assembled in the space that had been their prison, filling the void with ships that had been built in secret, crewed in silence, prepared for a war that had never been their own.
A communication came through. Captain Vance's voice, calm as ever.
Station Vigilant, this is Fleet Admiral Vance of the 1st Expeditionary Force. Earth Command has authorized full intervention against the devouring tide. Coordinates for the primary assault are being transmitted now. We recommend your remaining vessels fall into formation behind our central column. This will be over quickly.
Over quickly. I thought of the decades of war we had fought, the thousands of ships we had lost, the billions of lives extinguished. And here was a species we had dismissed as primitive, emerging from their cage with a fleet that dwarfed anything we had ever assembled, promising to end in days what we could not end in years.
All units, I heard myself say, this is Council of Vaelithrin. Follow the human fleet, match their trajectory, and bear witness to what comes next. The Battle of Kethril Prime, the first major engagement between humanity and the devouring tide, lasted 4 hours.
I watched it from the bridge of the serenity of purpose, now integrated into the massive human formation. I watched, and I did not understand what I was seeing.
The tide met the human fleet with the same tactics that had crushed 1,000 Kethvarani formations. They advanced in overwhelming numbers, their biomechanical vessels swarming toward the enemy, seeking to consume, to absorb, to add human technology and human biology to their ever-growing collective. They reached the human front line. And they died. I do not know how else to describe it. The human weapons did not simply destroy Tide vessels, they unraveled them. Energy beams that seemed to burn at the molecular level, missiles that released clouds of adaptive nanomachines that ate through Tide hull material like acid, interceptors that moved so fast our sensors could barely track them, dancing through enemy formations and leaving trails of debris in their wake. But it was not just the weapons. It was the way the humans fought. Every ship in their fleet operated as part of a single, unified organism. There were no gaps in their formation, no moments of hesitation, no communication delays. They anticipated each other's movements with uncanny precision, creating patterns of fire that left no escape for their enemies. And when the Tide attempted to adapt, to absorb human technology, to integrate human weapons into their collective, something extraordinary happened.
They could not. I watched a Tide assimilation vessel latch onto a human cruiser, its tendrils burrowing into the hull. For a moment, it seemed like the consumption was working. Then the tendrils began to blacken and crumble. The Tide vessel convulsed, its biomechanical structure rupturing from within.
"What is happening?" Yethril breathed. Beside us, Lieutenant Park had remained aboard as a liaison officer. He watched the destruction with an expression I could not read.
"The Tide works by absorption," he said quietly. They take biological and technological material and integrate it into their collective. They've done it to every species they've encountered.
But not to you.
No. Park's expression shifted, something that might have been dark satisfaction. Our biology doesn't integrate, it fights. Every human cell is a soldier. Every piece of our technology is designed to resist appropriation. He paused. The Tide has never encountered prey that fights back from the inside. They're trying to eat us, and we're eating them instead. The battle continued. Hour after hour, the human fleet advanced, and the Tide fell back. For the first time in a decade, the endless swarm was retreating. And behind them, in the space they abandoned, human ships were already deploying reconstruction drones, already rebuilding what had been destroyed, already preparing for the next phase. Kethril Prime was lost, but the Tide was breaking. The war lasted 3 months. 3 months to accomplish what the combined forces of a dozen ancient civilizations could not achieve in 10 years. 3 months to push the devouring Tide back across 1,000 light years, to shatter their central hive mind, to end their expansion forever. I did not witness all of it. No single observer could have. The human campaign unfolded across dozens of fronts simultaneously, their fleets coordinating with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. They did not just fight the Tide, they dismantled it, piece by piece, system by system. And they did it without cruelty. This perhaps surprised me most. I had expected humanity to wage war the way their history suggested, with fury, with vengeance, with the savage satisfaction of a species finally unleashed. Instead, they fought with something closer to mercy, When they could, they captured rather than destroyed. When they could, they liberated rather than conquered. They treated the absorbed populations of the Tide with medical technologies that could have healed wounds we did not even know how to diagnose.
They were not monsters. They were gardeners, pruning a disease from the body of the galaxy. On the day the last Tide flagship fell, I stood on the bridge of a human battleship at the personal invitation of Admiral Vance. Around us, the debris of the final battle drifted in silent testament to what had been accomplished.
"It's over," I said, and the words felt inadequate.
Yes. Vance stood beside me, looking out at the stars. She seemed smaller now, somehow, more human. The tide is broken. The surviving elements will fragment and dissipate. They'll never threaten the galaxy again.
"And what happens now?"
She turned to look at me, and in her eyes I saw something I had not expected. Weariness, uncertainty, perhaps even fear.
"That depends on you, Counselor, on what the Ascendancy decides, on what the rest of the galaxy chooses to believe about us." I understood what she was asking. Humanity had emerged from containment and saved civilization itself. But they had also demonstrated a power that made everything the galaxy had ever known seem insignificant by comparison. They could be partners, or they could be new masters. The choice was not theirs alone to make. "We feared you," I said slowly. "We feared your potential, your adaptability, your refusal to accept limits. We looked at your history of violence and saw a threat that would someday consume us all."
And now?
I thought carefully before I answered. I thought about everything I had witnessed, the quiet competence of human officers, the careful restraint of their weapons, the mercy shown to populations we would have abandoned. I thought about Captain Vance, who had every reason to hate us and chose instead to help. I thought about the message they had sent at the edge of the blockade, 160 years into their imprisonment.
"When you are ready to speak, we will listen." "Now I understand," I said. "We were right to fear you, but not for the reasons we believed." Vance's expression shifted slightly. "Explain."
We feared you would bring chaos. We feared you would disrupt the order we had built. We feared you would challenge our assumptions, our hierarchies, our comfortable certainties. I paused. We were right. You have done all of these things. But we were wrong about what that meant.
I turned to face her fully, and for the first time since the beginning of this nightmare, I felt something other than fear. I felt hope. "You are not a threat because you are dangerous. You are a threat because you are a mirror. You show us what we have become, cautious, rigid, so afraid of change that we would rather die than adapt. You show us that survival requires more than wisdom and age. It requires the willingness to grow, to fight, to become something new." Vance was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. "We learned that from you, in a way. Being contained taught us patience. It taught us that strength alone is not enough, that we needed wisdom too, that we needed to understand before we acted." She looked out at the stars. "We were always going to break the silence eventually, but your containment gave us time to grow into something better than we might have been."
Then we both learned something.
Perhaps. We stood together in silence, two representatives of species that should have been enemies, looking out at a galaxy that would never be the same. "What will humanity do now?" I asked. "You have the power to do anything." "We'll do what we've always done," Vance replied. "We'll build. We'll explore. We'll try to do better than we did yesterday." She glanced at me. "And we'll hope that this time we can do it with partners instead of alone."
The years that followed reshaped the galaxy in ways that historians will debate for centuries. The Kethvarani ascendancy, diminished but not destroyed, became humanity's first true ally. Other species followed, some eagerly, some reluctantly, some only after long negotiation. The old order collapsed, and something new rose in its place. Something messier, something louder, something that the ancient civilizations found uncomfortable and unfamiliar.
Something alive. I am old now, truly old, in a way that even my long-lived species rarely experiences. I have seen the galaxy transform from a collection of isolated empires into something approaching a genuine community. I have seen human cities rise on worlds that once belonged to the tide. I have seen children of 100 species playing together in schools where the language of instruction is often English. I have seen humanity do exactly what we feared they would.
They changed everything. And in changing everything, they saved us all.
The containment protocols have long since been declassified. The historical records show what we did and why we did it. There are those who call the Ascendancy's actions a crime against humanity, a century-long imprisonment of a species that had done nothing wrong.
They are not incorrect. But when I am asked about it, when young scholars and journalists seek the perspective of one who was there, I tell them what Captain Vance told me in those final hours of the war. The blockade was a wall built by fear. But walls can be incubators. Pressure can forge diamonds from carbon. And the species that had been violent and divided and close to destroying itself was given time in that quiet prison around a yellow star to become something greater than anyone imagined.
We meant to contain humanity.
Instead, we refined them.
160 years of isolation, and when the silence finally broke, it was not with a cry of rage or a demand for vengeance. It was with a simple question, asked in a voice so calm it still haunts me.
When you are ready to speak, we will listen. The Empire blockaded Earth. For over a century and a half, we held them in silence, certain that we were protecting the galaxy from something dangerous. We were wrong.
We were not protecting the galaxy from humanity.
We were protecting humanity for the galaxy. And when the moment came, when the devouring tide threatened to consume everything, when our ancient civilizations crumbled, when all hope seemed lost, one human vessel broke the silence.
Not with weapons, not with threats, with an open hand.
That is the truth of humanity. That is the secret we were too afraid to understand. They are not dangerous because of their capacity for violence. They are dangerous because of their capacity for patience, for mercy, for the kind of quiet strength that does not need to prove itself. They could have destroyed us for what we did. They could have conquered us, enslaved us, treated us with the same fear and contempt we showed them. Instead, they saved us, and they asked nothing in return except the chance to stand beside us. I am Valithrin. I am old. I have seen civilizations rise and fall. I have made decisions that cost billions of lives and decisions that may have saved trillions more. I have been afraid and proud and ashamed and hopeful.
But in all my long years, I have never felt what I felt on the day I watched humanity's fleet emerge from the containment we had built around their world. I have never felt such perfect, absolute awe.
They broke the silence, and the galaxy will never be silent again. This is the story of how humanity was found worthy. Not because they proved their strength, though their strength was beyond anything we imagined. Not because they proved their wisdom, though their wisdom was earned through suffering we never acknowledged.
They were found worthy, because when their prison opened, they did not emerge as prisoners.
They emerged as partners. And in that emergence, in that one vessel breaking through a century of silence, they reminded us all of something we had forgotten.
That the measure of a species is not how they treat their equals. It is how they treat those who once stood against them. Humanity chose mercy, and in choosing mercy, they became something the galaxy will never forget. They became hope